A babysitter is growing concerned. It's past pickup time, and Tricia Todd hasn't arrived to collect her 2-year-old daughter, Faith. This isn't like Tricia. She's a hospice nurse who works with the dying, punctual, responsible, devoted to her little girl. The babysitter tries calling. No answer. She waits another hour, then calls Tricia's family. By nightfall, everyone who knows her understands something is terribly wrong. But what no one knows yet, what won't be discovered for weeks, is that Tricia is already gone. And the person responsible isn't some stranger who broke into her home. It's someone she once promised to love forever. Someone who planned her death for months. Someone who bought the tools to erase her from existence long before he ever touched her. This is the story of a betrayal so complete, it would take a prosecutor's deal with the devil to uncover the truth. Welcome to True Crime Verge. Tonight we remember Tricia Todd, not for how she died, but for who she was and what was stolen from her. Take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. And now we begin.
Let's be clear about something. Tricia Todd wasn't a statistic. She wasn't just a case file or a news headline. She was a daughter, a mother, a veteran who served her country, a nurse who held dying patients' hands in their final moments. Born in Michigan, she grew up with a spirit that drew people to her. Those who knew her remember someone warm, caring, someone who lit up rooms without trying. Like so many young people looking for purpose, Tricia joined the United States Air Force. She served her country with honor, stationed at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, where she worked in food services. She completed her enlistment and transitioned to civilian life in 2008 with the same dedication she'd shown in uniform. It was during her time in the military that she met Stephen Williams. He was also in the Air Force, a staff sergeant on active duty. Their relationship developed, and eventually they married. For 11 years, she tried to make that marriage work. But by 2015, it had become clear the relationship was over. They divorced, and she was granted custody of their daughter, Faith, who was just learning to walk and talk. Tricia relocated to Hobe Sound, Florida, starting fresh. She found work as a hospice nurse, a calling that requires immense emotional strength. Day after day, she cared for patients at the end of their lives, bringing comfort when comfort was all that remained. Her colleagues remember her compassion. Her patients' families remember her kindness. And little Faith knew only that Mommy was always there, always dependable, always present. Stephen, meanwhile, had moved to North Carolina. The custody arrangement was clear. He could visit Faith, but Tricia retained primary custody. And this is where we need to pause and understand something crucial. What happened next wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't an argument that spiraled out of control. This was premeditation in its most chilling form. Months before Tricia vanished, Stephen was shopping. In North Carolina, far from Florida, he purchased items that would later tell a devastating story. Acid, a chainsaw, plastic containers. He didn't buy these on impulse. He researched, he planned, he prepared. And then he waited for the right moment. April 2016. Stephen told Tricia he wanted to visit their daughter. Under the custody arrangement, this was his right, and despite everything that had happened in their marriage, she wanted Faith to have a relationship with her father. He booked an Airbnb in Hobe Sound. He told people he was coming to spend time with his little girl. But the tools he'd bought months earlier, he'd already transported them to Florida. Before Tricia even knew he was coming, Stephen had driven to a remote area in Martin County, the Hungryland Wildlife and Environmental Area, a vast preserve of swamps and wilderness where few people ventured. And there, in the darkness and isolation, he dug a hole. Think about that. While she was going about her life, caring for dying patients, tucking Faith into bed, Her ex-husband was preparing her grave. The evening of April 27th started like any other. Tricia had dropped Faith at the babysitter's, gone to work, made plans to pick up her daughter later. But she never made it to that pickup. Investigators would later piece together what happened. Stephen came to her residence. Whether she let him in to discuss Faith, whether he forced entry, the exact sequence may never be fully known. What is known is that he killed Tricia in cold blood. But he didn't stop there. Using the chainsaw he'd purchased months earlier, he dismembered her body. Then, he placed her remains in a plastic container and poured acid over them. Acid he'd specifically bought to destroy human tissue. He loaded the container into his vehicle and drove to the hole he'd already dug in Hungryland Wildlife Area. He buried her there, in that shallow grave, miles from anywhere. And here's something that shows just how cold and calculated this man was. While he was ending Tricia's life and disposing of her body, their 2-year-old daughter Faith was sleeping alone in the Airbnb. He left his toddler by herself for hours while he erased her mother from existence. Then he cleaned up, returned to check on Faith, and acted as though nothing had happened. When her family reported Tricia missing, Stephen played the concerned ex-husband. He cooperated with police. He answered questions. He told investigators that she had mentioned going for late-night walks on the beach to connect with God. He suggested maybe she'd been kidnapped. He seemed worried, helpful even. But detectives were suspicious from the start. The circumstances were too convenient. His visit, her sudden disappearance, the custody disputes over Faith. And then the surveillance footage started coming in. Cameras throughout Martin County had been recording everything that night, and what they captured would eventually break his story wide open. Footage showed Stephen driving her car the night she vanished. More footage showed him at a gas station, filling up her tank. Then cameras captured him parking her vehicle near her house and jogging back toward his Airbnb. When detectives confronted him with this surveillance evidence, his story began to crack. First, he said maybe he'd moved her car. Then he admitted he'd been at her house. Then his account changed again. Maybe there'd been an accident. Detectives kept pressing, kept showing him video after video of his movements that night. The evidence was overwhelming. The lies were unraveling. Finally, he stopped denying. But he didn't reveal the whole truth. Not yet. What he did tell them was enough to get him arrested on May 26, 2016, exactly 1 month after Tricia vanished. Second-degree murder and child neglect, because investigators had confirmed something else chilling. While he was taking Tricia's life and disposing of her body, their 2-year-old daughter Faith had been alone, sleeping in the Airbnb. Prosecutors had Stephen. They had surveillance footage. They had his ever-changing confessions. But they didn't have Tricia. And without her body, the case had weaknesses. Defense attorneys could argue accident, could create reasonable doubt, could make prosecution difficult. Assistant State Attorney Tom Bakadal faced an agonizing decision. He consulted with her family. Her parents wanted closure. They wanted to bring their daughter home. They wanted to be able to lay her to rest with dignity. So prosecutors approached Stephen with an offer. Show us where she is. Lead us to her body. Tell us what you did. And we'll take the death penalty off the table. You'll get 35 years instead of facing execution. His defense attorney negotiated the terms, and finally, he agreed. On May 27, 2016, detectives drove Stephen, now in an orange jumpsuit, hands shackled, through the remote Hungryland Wildlife Preserve. The video footage of this journey is chilling. He sat calmly in the back seat, directing officers through unmarked paths deep into the swamp and scrubland. Turn here. Go straight. Stop. When they reached a recently disturbed patch of ground about 3 miles into the preserve, he shuffled forward in his shackles and planted a red evidence marker directly on the spot. The digging began. As the sun began to set over Hungryland Preserve, crime scene technicians worked carefully, excavating the shallow grave he had led them to. About 3 feet down, they found a large plastic container. Sheriff William Snyder arrived at the scene. In his decades of law enforcement, he'd seen unspeakable things, but nothing had prepared him for this. The container was filled with liquid, acid, and in that acid were Tricia's remains, in advanced stages of decomposition. But here's what devastated everyone at that crime scene. These weren't complete remains. These were partial remains. Most of what had been Tricia Todd, the Air Force veteran, the hospice nurse, the devoted mother, had been reduced to liquid. Sheriff Snyder would later say something that captures the horror of what they found. In all my years of law enforcement, we've never had to deploy a hazmat team to recover human remains. A hazmat team. To recover what was left of a person. At a press conference that evening, the sheriff's voice was heavy with emotion. The body was mutilated and appeared to have been dismembered with a chainsaw. We will not be satisfied until we've discovered all of her remains. Because that was the other devastating truth. Stephen hadn't led them to all of Tricia. He'd only shown them one burial site. The plea agreement specified he would lead them to Tricia Todd's remains, all of them. But most of her was simply gone, destroyed by acid. Assistant State Attorney Tom Backadall stood at that crime scene in Hungryland Preserve, watching the hazmat team work. And he made a statement that captured everyone's horror. It's an unfortunate reality that yes, in this business, you have to make a deal with the devil. And I made a deal with the devil. He described Stephen's demeanor as cold, without feeling, without remorse, without sympathy. He said it shocked the conscience to know people like this walk among us. The plea deal had been made to fine Tricia, to bring her home to her family, to give them closure. But he had violated even that agreement. He'd promised to lead them to all of her remains. Instead, he'd only shown them a container of liquid and partial remains. Sheriff Snyder said the plea deal might be in jeopardy. Clearly, we're not satisfied with what we have tonight. This is a wrinkle or a hurdle that we could not have anticipated. But without his cooperation, they never would have found even this much of her. The family faced an impossible choice. Accept the deal and get justice, even if it meant he would avoid the death penalty. Or risk losing him to a trial where his lawyers might create doubt, where he might walk free. They chose justice. They chose to make sure he would spend decades in prison. When Stephen finally stood before a judge for sentencing, the full scope of his premeditation was laid bare. The acid and chainsaw purchased months in advance. The grave dug before he even killed her. The surveillance footage showing his calculated movements. The fact that he'd left his own daughter alone while he ended her mother's life. His motive? According to prosecutors, he didn't want to pay child support. He wanted full custody of Faith. And he was enraged that she had disrespected him by divorcing him and moving on with her life. A woman's entire existence, planned out for destruction, erased because her ex-husband didn't want to fulfill his financial obligations to their child. The judge's words were damning. He called the actions evil beyond comprehension. He noted the complete lack of remorse, the cold calculation, the violation of trust. Stephen was sentenced to 35 years in prison. His earliest possible release date is decades away. But for her family, no sentence would ever be enough. No amount of time could restore what was stolen. No punishment could bring her back. Today, Faith is being raised by Tricia's family, people who make sure she knows who her mother was, who ensure her memory lives on through stories and photographs and love. They tell Faith about her mother's service in the Air Force. They tell her about her compassion as a hospice nurse. They make sure she knows that her mother loved her more than anything in this world. Her family has worked to honor her memory in other ways too. They want the world to know she wasn't just a victim. She was a woman who served her country with honor, who cared for the dying with grace, who loved her daughter fiercely. The Hobe Sound community was shaken to its core. This wasn't a random attack by a stranger. This was intimate violence. A man who had promised to love her, who had created a life with her, who turned that closeness into the means of her destruction. For the investigators and prosecutors who worked this case, it remains one of the most disturbing they've ever encountered. Not just because of the violence, but because of the cold calculation behind it. He didn't kill in a moment of rage. He didn't kill in the heat of passion. He killed because it was convenient for him. Because her existence, her demands for child support, her custody of their daughter, had become an inconvenience. And so he planned for months. He bought the tools. He dug the grave. And when the moment came, he executed his plan with chilling precision. Then he tried to erase every trace of her, as if she'd never existed at all. But Tricia Todd did exist, and she mattered.
Tricia was 30 years old when she died. She had served her country honorably in the United States Air Force. She had dedicated her professional life to easing others' suffering as a hospice nurse, sitting with dying patients, holding their hands, bringing comfort in their final moments. She had been looking forward to watching her daughter grow up, to Faith's first day of school, to teaching her to ride a bike, to all those small, precious moments that make up a life. All of that was stolen by someone who had once stood before witnesses and promised to cherish her. This case reminds us that domestic violence doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself with bruises or police calls. Sometimes it waits quietly, planning, preparing. Sometimes it wears the mask of a concerned father. Sometimes it speaks reasonably to investigators. Sometimes it plans meticulously for months before striking. But this case also reminds us that even when evil tries to erase someone completely, even when it tries to destroy them utterly, love ensures they're not forgotten. Her family makes sure Faith knows her mother. The community remembers her service and her compassion. And we, by telling her story, ensure that Tricia Todd is remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, for her dedication to caring for others in their final moments, for her service to her country, for her love for her daughter. Tricia Todd mattered. Her life had meaning. Her service had value. Her daughter carries her legacy forward every day. While he sits in a prison cell, Faith is growing up surrounded by people who loved Tricia, who make sure she knows her mother was a hero, a veteran, a nurse, a woman who gave everything to those she cared for. That is her true legacy, not the horror of her death, but the beauty of her life. Remember the victims, not the killers. Rest in peace, Tricia.